The P-47 Thunderbolt shuddered as cannon fire tore through its right wing. Lieutenant James Harker pulled back on the stick, but the aircraft barely responded. Above him, 4 Focke-Wulf 190s circled like wolves, their altitude advantage absolute. They had speed. They had position. They had numbers. Every manual Harker had ever studied said the same thing. Dive away. Use the Thunderbolt's weight to build speed. Run for the clouds. But Harker did something else. He cut his throttle back. The engine noise dropped to a murmur. The airspeed indicator began falling toward stall speed. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be dissected in fighter tactics courses for the next 30 years. This was February 1944. The skies over occupied France had become a killing ground for Allied bomber escorts. The Luftwaffe was desperate, experienced, and willing to sacrifice everything to stop the daylight raids. Every mission bled pilots. Every engagement taught a lesson written in fire and metal. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. Harker was 23 years old. He had grown up in a farming town in Nebraska where the horizon stretched flat and endless. Before the war, he studied engineering at a state college, spending more time with textbooks than people. When he enlisted, his squadron mates called him Professor. It was not a compliment. In the barracks, they talked about girls and gambling. Harker sketched diagrams of engine thrust ratios and calculated fuel consumption curves. During briefings, he asked questions about German fighter tactics that made other pilots roll their eyes. He was smart, they said, but war was not won by men who thought too much. The 56th Fighter Group had earned its reputation through aggression. Their top aces were men who dove first, fired first, and sorted out the wreckage later. Harker did not fit. His gunnery scores were average. His first 3 missions ended without a single shot fired. After his 4th sortie, his flight leader pulled him aside and said, "Stop thinking and start shooting." Harker nodded, but the advice felt wrong. Speed and firepower won fights, yes, but only if you were already in position to use them. And position, Harker believed, was a matter of geometry and timing, not courage. The mission that morning had been routine until it was not. 16 P-47s escorting B-17s deep into France. The bombers hit an aircraft factory near Reims. Flak turned the sky black. 2 bombers went down trailing smoke. Then the German fighters appeared. They came out of the sun, as they always did, diving through the American formation in tight pairs. The radio exploded with voices. Bandits high, bandits left, break right. Harker's flight scattered. Within seconds, he was alone. He spotted the Focke-Wulfs 3,000 feet above him, black crosses sharp against the winter sky. 4 of them, already turning into their attack dive. Harker felt his heartbeat slow, the way it did when he worked through a difficult equation. The problem was clear. They had altitude, which meant speed. They had numbers. They would dive on him in sequence, attacking from different angles, forcing him to choose which one to defend against. If he turned hard to evade one, another would have a clean shot. If he dove, they would follow him down and simply outdive him. If he climbed, he would bleed speed and become an easy target. Standard doctrine was unambiguous. Use the Thunderbolt strengths. Dive away, build separation, extend until you could reset the fight. Harker's hand moved toward the throttle to push it forward. Then he stopped. The math did not work. The 190s were already diving. They already had momentum. Even the Thunderbolt's impressive dive performance would not create enough separation before they closed to firing range. He would be a target moving in a straight line, unable to maneuver without slowing down. The first burst would probably cripple him. The second would finish it. He thought about the engineering problem differently. What did the German pilots expect? They expected him to dive. Their tactics were built around that assumption. They would aim ahead of his flight path, anticipating his speed increase. They would space their attacks to cover his escape angles. Everything they did in the next 10 seconds would be predicated on his attempt to run. Harker felt the thought settle into certainty. If he gave them what they expected, he would die. So he would give them the opposite. The first 190 came screaming down, its nose flashing as the cannons opened up. Harker saw the tracers arcing toward him. bright and slow-looking at this distance. He pulled the throttle back to idle. The Thunderbolt's nose dropped slightly. The airspeed began bleeding off. 190 knots. 180. The controls went mushy. The aircraft felt balanced on the edge of falling. Through his windscreen, Harker watched the German fighter grow larger. The pilot would be adjusting his aim now, compensating for the closure rate, waiting for the range to tighten. But the closure rate was changing. Harker's sudden deceleration meant the geometry was collapsing faster than expected. The 190 flashed past, 50 feet above Harker's canopy. The German pilot had not fired again. He had overshot. Harker felt the turbulence from the enemy's slipstream shake his aircraft. Then the second 190 was coming in, steeper this time, trying to correct for what the first pilot had missed. Harker kept his throttle at idle. His airspeed dropped through 170 knots. The stall warning buffet began, a shaking in the control stick that said he was seconds from losing lift entirely. The second 190's guns lit up. Cannon shells walked through the air where Harker's aircraft should have been, but he was no longer there. He had slowed so much that his position had shifted backward in space. The shells passed in front of him, a stream of lethal metal hitting nothing. The second German overshot as well, pulling up hard to avoid collision. Harker shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney engine roared back to life, coughing once before the power surged. The Thunderbolt accelerated, still slow, but no longer helpless. The third and fourth 190s were still above him, repositioning for their runs. They had seen what happened to their wingmen, but they did not understand it yet. From their perspective, Harker's aircraft had simply appeared in the wrong place, as if it had teleported backward. They would be recalculating, questioning their speed estimates, wondering if their lead pilots had misjudged. Harker used the confusion. He turned hard left, pulling the stick into his lap, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. The horizon spun. Blood drained from his head. His vision narrowed to a gray tunnel. He held the turn, watching the turn-and-slip indicator, keeping the aircraft on the edge of its performance envelope. When he rolled wings level, he had gained angle. Not much, but enough. One of the 190s was no longer directly behind him. It was off to his right, pulling through a climbing turn, trying to reposition. Harker nosed toward it and fired a burst. The .50 caliber rounds fell short, but the German pilot saw them and broke off, unwilling to commit without an advantage. The fourth 190 was smarter. Its pilot did not dive immediately. He stayed high, circling, watching. Harker could see him up there, a dark speck against the clouds. This one understood. He would wait until Harker's speed was predictable again, then attack with discipline. Harker checked his fuel. He had maybe 20 minutes before he would need to turn for home. The rest of his flight was somewhere out there, but the radio was a chaos of overlapping calls. He was on his own. The German pilot began his dive. Harker watched him come, calculating angles. The 190 was slightly offset, approaching from Harker's 5 o'clock high. A good attack angle, hard to defend. Harker let his airspeed build this time, accelerating to 200 knots. The German would see that. He would assume Harker was running now, that the earlier trick had been desperation. Harker held his course, straight and level, as if resigned. The 190 closed, its wings steady, its aim precise. At 400 yards, Harker cut the throttle again, but this time he also pulled up, trading speed for altitude in a sudden zoom climb. The Thunderbolt's nose pitched skyward. The airspeed dropped catastrophically. The German's firing solution evaporated. His shells passed beneath Harker's tail. As the 190 flashed past below him, Harker snap-rolled inverted and pulled through, a maneuver that reversed his direction and pointed his nose down at the departing enemy. For one perfect moment, he had angles. He was slow, almost stalling, hanging in the air, but his guns were pointed at the German 6 o'clock. Harker pressed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber machine guns hammered. The convergence was good. Rounds walked up the 190's fuselage. White smoke erupted from the engine. The German fighter rolled violently, trying to evade, but the damage was done. It nosed over into a steep dive, trailing fire. Harker did not watch it fall. The other three 190s were already turning back toward him. His altitude was gone. His speed was gone. He was hanging in the air like a target in a shooting gallery. But he had proven something. The maneuver worked. They had expected speed and predictability. He had given them neither. Now the Germans would be cautious. Caution meant hesitation. Hesitation meant time. Harker pushed the throttle forward again, diving away, building speed while the enemy fighters reset their attacks. His hands were steady on the controls. His breathing was even behind the oxygen mask. The fear was still there, distant and cold, but it did not control him. The math controlled him. The geometry controlled him. And right now, the math said he could survive this. The remaining 3 190s formed up and began a coordinated attack, coming in from different angles. They had learned. Harker banked hard, keeping his speed up this time, forcing them to commit. The sky became a tangle of turning aircraft, each pilot trying to predict the other's next move. Harker's aircraft shuddered under the strain. Metal groaned. The engine temperature gauge climbed into the red. He ignored it. One of the 190s locked onto his tail, firing in short bursts. Rounds punched through his left elevator. The stick went heavy. Harker kicked the rudder and skidded sideways, the thunderbolt sliding through the air like a car on ice. The German's next burst missed wide. Then, from above, another P-47 dove into the fight. Then another. Harker's flight had found him. The German pilots saw the new arrivals and broke off immediately, diving away toward their own lines. They had lost one aircraft and gained nothing. The fight was over. Harker leveled his wings and checked his instruments. Oil pressure was dropping. The elevator damage made the aircraft sluggish, but the engine still ran. The controls still responded. He was alive. The flight reformed and turned west, toward England. No one spoke on the radio. There would be time for questions later. Harker trimmed the aircraft as best he could and settled into the long flight home. Below, the French countryside unrolled in shades of winter brown and gray. Somewhere down there, a German pilot was probably climbing out of his crashed fighter. If he had survived, Harker did not feel triumph. He felt tired, and he felt certain. The maneuver had worked not because it was aggressive, but because it was unexpected. Speed was an advantage only if your opponent could predict where you would be. Take away that predictability, and speed became a liability. The landing at the 56th's base was rough. Harker's damaged elevator made the flare difficult, and the Thunderbolt hit the runway hard, bouncing once before settling. He taxied to the hard stand, shut down the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. He pulled off his oxygen mask and gloves, flexed his fingers, and climbed out onto the wing. The ground crew was already swarming the aircraft, counting holes, shaking their heads at the damage. One of the mechanics whistled low when he saw the elevator. "How'd you get her down with that?" he asked. Harker just shrugged. He did not have words for it yet. The debriefing room smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke. The intelligence officer sat at a table with a map spread out, marking positions as pilots called them out. Harker's flight leader described the engagement in broad strokes. Multiple bandits, scattered formation, running fight back to friendly territory. Then he pointed at Harker. "Professor here got jumped by 4 190s. Alone. Want to explain how you're still breathing?" The room went quiet. 12 pilots turned to look at Harker. He stood, walked to the map, and tried to explain. He talked about closure rates and energy states. He described cutting throttle to force an overshoot. He drew diagrams in the air with his hands, showing how the German pilots' expectations had worked against them. Most of the pilots stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. But the squadron commander, a major with 200 combat hours, leaned forward. "You slowed down," he said, "while being chased." Harker nodded. "It breaks their firing solution. If they're diving on you with a speed advantage, they're calculating where you'll be in 2 seconds, 3 seconds. If you suddenly decelerate, you're not there anymore. They overshoot." The major tapped his pencil on the table. "And if you misjudge the timing, you stall out and they shoot you to pieces." Harker nodded again. "Yes, sir. It has to be exact." The room was silent for a long moment. Then the major said, "Write it up. Full report." Diagrams, numbers, everything. I want it on my desk tomorrow. That night, in the barracks, the mockery had a different tone. Professor's got a new trick, one pilot said, slowing down to go faster. Another laughed. Next he'll tell us to fly backward. But the jokes felt hollow. They had all seen Harker's aircraft on the hardstand, riddled with holes, but still flyable. They had all heard the count. For enemy fighters, 1 friendly aircraft, 1 confirmed kill, 0 friendly losses. The math spoke for itself. Harker sat on his bunk and wrote the report by lamplight, filling page after page with careful diagrams and explanations. He knew most pilots would never use it. It required too much precision, too much timing, too much willingness to flirt with a stall while enemy guns were firing. But some would, the ones who thought like he did, the ones who saw combat as a physics problem wrapped in terror. The report went up the chain of command. Within a week, a training officer from 8th Air Force Headquarters flew in to interview Harker. He brought a stenographer and spent 3 hours asking questions, making Harker repeat details, pushing for specifics. How much throttle reduction? How long can you hold it? What's the minimum speed before control effectiveness is lost? Harker answered everything, drawing on the chalkboard in the briefing room, calculating margins. The training officer took notes and said nothing. When he left, Harker assumed that was the end of it. The military did not change tactics because one lieutenant had a theory. But 3 weeks later, the squadron received new training directives. They included a section on defensive energy management and throttle manipulation against diving attacks. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but Harker recognized his own ideas embedded in the text. Other squadrons began experimenting with the technique. Not everyone could make it work. It required a feel for the aircraft's limits that most pilots did not have. But the ones who mastered it found the same thing Harker had. German pilots trained to exploit speed advantages became confused and vulnerable when their targets refused to behave predictably. Reports began filtering back from across the theater. AP-51 pilot over Germany used the technique to force 2 Me-109s into a mid-air collision. AP-38 driver in Italy dragged 4 190s down to stall speed, where his twin-engine aircraft's superior low-speed handling gave him the advantage. The maneuver had no official name, but pilots started calling it the Harker throttle trap. Harker himself flew 30 more missions. He shot down 2 more German fighters using variations of the technique and returned home in November 1944 with the Distinguished Flying Cross and a reputation that had shifted from mockery to respect. He never became an ace. He never sought the spotlight. After the war, he went back to Nebraska, finished his engineering degree, and spent 40 years designing aircraft instruments for Boeing. He rarely talked about the war. When former squadron mates found him at reunions, they wanted to hear about that February mission, about the moment he cut the throttle with 4 190s diving on him. Harker would smile, shrug, and say it had made sense at the time. The math had been simple. Either do what they expected and die, or do something they could not predict and maybe survive. But the legacy lived on in fighter tactics manuals. By the 1950s, jet pilots were learning energy management principles that traced directly back to Harker's report. The idea that speed was not always an advantage, that predictability could be a fatal weakness, that survival sometimes meant doing the opposite of instinct. These concepts became foundational. Korean War F. 86 pilots used throttle manipulation to bait MiG-15s into overshoots. Vietnam-era instructors at Nellis Air Force Base taught the principle under different names, but the core remained. Control your energy state, deny the enemy a predictable solution, survive by staying inside their decision loop. The Germans had their own perspective on that February engagement. After the war, records from WW2 revealed that the surviving pilots filed reports about an American fighter that decelerated impossibly and appeared to move backward in the attack run. One pilot wrote that it felt like fighting an opponent who was not playing by the same rules. The German tactical response was to assume the Americans had developed a new aircraft variant with unusual handling characteristics. They never understood that it was simply one pilot, in a standard aircraft, applying engineering principles under pressure. The assumption that technology was the answer, rather than technique, cost the Luftwaffe dearly. They kept attacking American fighters the same way, and pilots who had learned from Harker kept surviving. By war's end, the 56th Fighter Group had the highest kill ratio of any P-47 unit in Europe. The official history attributed this to aggressive tactics and superior aircraft maintenance. But squadron veterans knew better. They had watched the evolution, the slow shift from pure aggression to calculated aggression, from speed and firepower to energy and positioning. Harker had not created that shift alone, but he had been its clearest voice. His willingness to question doctrine, to treat combat as a solvable problem rather than a test of courage, had given other pilots permission to think. And thinking, it turned out, kept you alive. There's a photograph from March 1944, 1 month after Harker's engagement, showing him standing beside his P-47 with his ground crew. The aircraft's nose bears for small swastikas marking kills. Harker is smiling slightly, hands in his pockets, looking more like a college student than a fighter pilot. Behind him, barely visible, is the patched elevator damage from that February mission. The ground crew chief later said that Harker had insisted on keeping that specific aircraft for the rest of his tour, even though regulation allowed him to rotate to an undamaged plane. When asked why, Harker said the aircraft had proven it could take damage and keep flying. That was worth more than a fresh paint job. The moral of Harker's story is not about bravery, though he had that. It is not about natural talent, though he developed skill through practice. It is about the willingness to see problems differently, to trust mathematics over instinct, to accept that survival sometimes requires doing the thing that feels most dangerous. The German pilots who attacked him that day were experienced, aggressive, and well-trained. They did everything their doctrine taught them to do. They lost because doctrine assumes predictability, and Harker refused to be predictable. In a war defined by massive formations, industrial production, and overwhelming force, one thoughtful pilot with a slide rule mind found an edge in the physics of the moment. Modern fighter pilots still study energy management. They use different terminology, fly different aircraft, face different threats. But the principle remains unchanged. Control your energy state. Deny the enemy a predictable solution. Survive by thinking faster than they can react. Harker would probably be surprised that his split-second decision over France became a textbook case study. He never thought of himself as a tactician or an innovator. He thought of himself as someone trying to solve a problem with the tools available. The tools happened to be a throttle, a control stick, and the willingness to trust that physics works the same way whether you are in a classroom or in combat. The 56th Fighter Group's reunion in 1989 was held in San Antonio. Harker attended. Now in his late 60s, his hair gray, his engineer's hands marked by decades of careful work. Young Air Force officers approached him throughout the evening, asking about that February mission, about the moment he cut throttle. Harker answered their questions patiently, drawing the same diagrams he had drawn 45 years earlier. One officer asked if he had been scared. Harker paused, considered, and said, "Terrified, but fear doesn't change physics. The German pilot still had to solve the same intercept problem I did. I just made sure my solution was simpler than his." The officer nodded, filed that away, and went back to his squadron to think about what it meant. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. In the end, warfare is often reduced to patterns, attack angles, firing solutions, predictable responses. The side that breaks those patterns first, that forces the enemy to recalculate in the middle of a fight, gains an advantage measured in seconds. And in aerial combat, seconds are lifetimes. Harker understood this not because he was fearless, but because he was willing to think when others simply reacted. That willingness, that insistence on seeing the problem clearly even when death was seconds away, turned a bookish engineer from Nebraska into a pilot whose ideas outlived the war by generations. The question is not whether you have the skill to survive. The question is whether you have the discipline to think when thinking is the last thing your instincts want you to do. Harker answered that question at 12,000 feet over France, with his throttle at idle and 4 enemy fighters screaming toward him. The answer kept him alive. And it might keep you alive too. If you ever find yourself in a moment where the expected choice is the fatal one,